I came home late that evening, somewhere between the last round of traffic and the moment when the streetlights started reflecting off the pavement, like someone had glossed over the whole town with a tired coat of water. And while my hands were aching just slightly from the weight of the grocery bags, nothing dramatic, just a few things I grabbed on the way out. A loaf of bread, a bottle of wine, a couple of yogurts, some greens. I remember thinking that the way I moved through the wet sidewalks and the quiet parking lot summed up my entire day better than words ever could, because it had been one of those long, drawn-out, heavy days where I spoke to people without ever really speaking to them, like their voices were just ambient noise echoing off the walls of empty apartments I was showing, places that smelled faintly of furniture polish and other people's pasts. And by the time I got back to my car, I couldn't remember a single face. As I stepped into the building and pushed open the old metal door that always stuck just a little at the bottom corner, I saw him again. Andrew, the neighbor from 2 floors down, the one who always had his headphones on like he couldn't stand the sound of his own thoughts, the one who smoked on the stairs because, as he once told me, the balcony doesn't feel honest. And that night he looked up from whatever song he was drowning in, locked eyes with me like I had walked into the wrong frame of someone else's film, and said, "You're carrying those bags like they've got somebody's life in them, not just groceries." Which was such a strange, unnecessary thing to say, but somehow not annoying, not intrusive almost. Warm in the smallest, oddest way. I didn't respond, not because I was offended or confused, but because something about what he said touched a part of me that hadn't been touched in a long time. Not physically, but emotionally, like someone pressing their thumb against a bruise you didn't realize was still sore. And as I stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the 6th floor, I could still feel that small tremor at the corners of my mouth. Not a smile exactly, but the beginning of one. The kind that slips out before you can stop it. I didn't say anything to him, just nodded politely in that way women do when they want to acknowledge something without inviting anything more. But as the elevator climbed, I realized I was holding the bags tighter than necessary. Not out of effort, but out of some instinct I didn't have the courage to examine. And by the time I reached my door and stepped inside, I knew that smile hadn't belonged to me in a long time. The first thing I noticed when I got home was the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Not that pod stuff, because James always brewed it the old-fashioned way, with a metal filter and measured scoops, even though he hardly ever drank more than a sip or two. Said he preferred the smell to the taste. And when I walked into the kitchen, there he was, just like always, methodical, calm, speaking without looking up as he stirred the pot, saying, "You're right on time. It's almost done." And that was it. That was all he said, because James is the kind of man who believes actions are stronger than words. And I've always accepted that about him, respected it, even loved him for it in my own way. But that night, it stung just a little that he didn't ask how my day was. Didn't wonder if my shoulders ached or if I'd eaten. Didn't want to hear my voice, even out of habit. We had dinner in silence. Not the kind that follows an argument, but the kind that lives in the quiet places between two people who've stopped reaching, who've learned how to coexist without making waves. And while I ate the fish he made, which was too salty, though I didn't say anything, I had this bizarre out-of-body moment. Like I was sitting at someone else's table in someone else's chair, wearing someone else's skin, because my body was there. But my thoughts had stayed somewhere else entirely. Maybe back in that stairwell, or in the hallway, or maybe still floating in that one line about my groceries. After dinner, I washed the dishes, careful not to clatter the plates, though it didn't matter since James had already gone into his office and shut the door behind him like he always did. And once I was alone in the kitchen, I walked down the hall to the bathroom, not because I needed to freshen up, but because sometimes the mirror is the only place that reminds you still exist. I peeled off my sweater, reached for the elastic in my hair, and stood there under the too white light, looking not for beauty, because I wasn't naive enough to expect that, but for something else entirely. Something beneath the skin and above the bone. Something that might tell me I was still alive in ways I'd forgotten how to notice. And as I looked at my chest, my collarbones, my knees, the soft slack at the back of my arms, I didn't feel shame or disgust. I felt distance, like I was observing myself from just outside the frame. And for the first time in a very long time, I thought not about what I looked like, but what I wanted to feel again. Not admiration, Not attention, not even desire in the dramatic sense, but simply that electric thread of recognition, the kind that passes between two people who see each other without needing to explain a thing. That morning started like any other, with the same familiar motion of slippers against hardwood, the same creak in the bathroom door hinge that we kept forgetting to fix, the same small silence between pouring hot water into the mug and walking to the window while waiting for it to steep. Except this time there was something lodged in my chest. Not pain exactly, but a kind of buzzing pressure. Like my body had registered that something important was about to happen before I'd even left the apartment. And while James shaved in the other room, humming under his breath like always, I found myself standing by the door with one hand on the handle and the other brushing invisible lint from my coat, as if smoothing out fabric would smooth out whatever that ache was trying to become. As soon as I stepped out into the hallway, I knew I wouldn't be alone, because that building with its thin air and echoing stairwells had this way of alerting you to presence. Maybe it was the shift in pressure, maybe the faint creak of rubber soles against concrete. But the moment I locked the door behind me and turned toward the elevator, I saw him, leaning against the wall like he'd been waiting. Even though I knew that was impossible, irrational even, yet somehow not surprising in the least. There was only one elevator in our building, and it was slow, temperamental, the kind that groaned and clanked and made you regret using it if you were in a hurry. And as we both stepped inside, me with my bag slung over one shoulder, him with nothing but a phone in his hand and that maddening ease in his posture, the door shut behind us with that dull metal sigh, and we began the crawl down toward the ground floor. The lighting was worse than usual, one of the ceiling panels flickering with that tired fluorescent twitch that always made me feel like I was inside some low-budget detective movie. And while I tried to keep my eyes forward, focused on the numbers counting down, I could feel his gaze not directly on me, but on the mirrored panel across from us, watching me the way someone might look at a painting they don't fully understand but can't look away from. And then he said it, without turning, without even changing the rhythm of his breathing, in a voice so level it sounded like he was commenting on the weather, except the words didn't belong to something casual or forgettable, because what he said was, "Have you ever kissed someone knowing it would ruin everything? There are moments when time slows for no reason you can explain to anyone else. Moments where the air feels heavier, like it's wrapped in something thick and humming, and standing there beside him in that flickering box of metal and silence." I didn't answer. Not with words, not with a glance, not even with breath. I just stood there, suddenly aware of how loud my own heartbeat sounded in my ears, of how close his arm was to mine without touching, of the faint smell of leather and citrus and cigarette smoke clinging to the collar of his coat, a smell that was no longer unfamiliar to me. And then the elevator jerked, not violently, just enough to knock me half a step off balance. And the numbers stopped between 3 and 4, the light above blinking red for a second before dying entirely, plunging us into that dim, suspended quiet that feels more intimate than it has any right to be. We didn't speak. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything would have made it real, would have broken the boundary that was already paper thin. And in that silence, I became hyper-aware of my own body. The way my fingers curled slightly, the chill creeping into my calves, the heat in my cheeks, the prickle at the base of my neck. And somehow, without ever turning toward him, I knew he was cataloging the same things. That we were both measuring the space between us in degrees of restraint. Eventually, the elevator stuttered back to life, sluggish and unapologetic, like it had just remembered it was supposed to be functioning. And when the doors opened on the ground floor, I stepped out first, faster than I needed to, with just enough purpose in my stride to convince myself I had somewhere important to be, even though the truth was, I didn't want to look at him, didn't want to see whether he'd stayed behind or followed, because I knew that if he had looked at me in that moment, really looked, I wouldn't have been able to pretend. When I got home later that evening, still wrapped in the residue of that silence, James was sitting at the dining table, flipping through the day's mail with that same quiet efficiency he brought to every part of life. And as I walked into the kitchen to wash my hands, I heard him say, without looking up, "You smile at the elevator more than you smile at me these days." And there it was. Not an accusation, not even jealousy, but observation. Plain and simple. And while I could have laughed it off, could have made some joke about the broken lights or the smell of mildew in the corners, I didn't. I just turned on the water, let it run until it was too hot to keep my hands under it, and scrubbed my fingers longer than necessary, watching the soap slip over my knuckles like it could wash away the tension I hadn't yet named. And as the water kept running and my skin turned red beneath the heat, I stared at the sink and told myself, over and over, in a voice that was no longer firm but still trying, don't, just don't. The message came in just after 4:30, while I was still sitting at my desk pretending to care about client updates I wasn't actually reading. And before I even finished the subject line, I already knew it was him. Because there's a particular kind of timing that doesn't happen by accident, and that afternoon it felt deliberate, like he somehow sensed I'd say yes before I even thought to hesitate. He wrote, "You free for a bit? Need to drop something off. Kind of boring alone." I stared at it, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because I knew exactly what my answer meant. And after 2 minutes that felt longer than they should have, I typed, "I'm already in the parking lot." He got into the car without any hurry, the way someone would if they were stepping into a place they already felt comfortable in. And I noticed the way he didn't say hello or smile or do anything to acknowledge the tension that had clearly made its home between us since the last time we stood too close. He had a cardboard box on his lap, not large, but taped on the sides like it mattered what was inside. I never asked what it was. And he placed one hand on it lightly, the way people touch things that belong to them without needing to prove it. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, not because I was afraid to look at him, but because I already knew what his face would tell me, and I wasn't ready to confront the parts of myself that wanted to see it anyway. We pulled out of the parking space slowly, merging into the late afternoon traffic like we weren't doing anything unusual. And yet the silence between us wasn't the casual kind people fall into after a long day. It was the kind that builds when two people are already halfway through a decision they haven't spoken out loud. As we reached the third intersection, a light rain began to fall, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder or drama, but simply appears as though the sky decided it didn't owe anyone an explanation. The wipers moved at their lowest setting, brushing away the droplets that slid like question marks down the windshield, and when he finally said, "Take the next right," it wasn't a suggestion, and it didn't feel like one either. I turned onto a service road without any signage, the kind that looks like it hasn't been repaved in decades, where grass eats away at the edges of the asphalt. And as I slowed the car beside a thicket of trees that formed a half-hearted barrier from the main road, he didn't move immediately, just sat still with that unreadable expression that always made me feel like I was being watched by someone who knew too much and said too little. I don't know who leaned in first. And maybe that's the part that still bothers me, because if I could pinpoint the moment this crossed from tension into action, maybe I could explain it away or tell myself I wasn't in control. But the truth is, I was. We both were. I closed my eyes before our mouths met, not from shyness, but because the second our bodies made contact, I didn't want to see the look in his eyes that would confirm just how badly I wanted this to happen. There weren't any words exchanged, not even the careless kind meant to break silence, and instead we moved like people who knew what came next, unbuckling with quiet efficiency, sliding into the back seat without clumsiness or shame, and though the windows fogged faster than I expected, I wasn't surprised, because heat like that doesn't ask for permission. It just takes. We didn't take off clothes. Not entirely. Just enough to make space for the kind of intimacy that doesn't belong to strangers and doesn't belong to lovers either. The kind that burns and vanishes and leaves everything smelling different, even if no one speaks of it. It wasn't tender or slow or anything that could be mistaken for affection. It was need, raw and fast and deeply unwise. When it ended, I pulled myself together with more urgency than dignity, tugging at my blouse like that would undo the heat still caught in the air, and I slid into the driver's seat while he stayed back, breathing unevenly, one arm thrown over the headrest like he had every right to take up space I no longer wanted to share. I dropped him off 3 blocks from his building, because that's what he asked for, and because I couldn't bear the idea of watching him disappear into the same doorway he once leaned against while asking me how long I'd lived upstairs. I didn't say goodbye, and neither did he. And the silence that followed me home was the kind that doesn't fade with music or windows down. It just sits with you, quietly, until it becomes part of the room. The next morning, James took the car to get gas, just like he always did on Sundays. And I watched from the window, holding my mug too tightly, because I knew what he was going to see the moment he opened that door and sat down. The passenger seat had been pushed back, farther than I ever set it, angled in a way that no explanation could erase. And even if I'd tried to remember whether I'd adjusted it by accident, I wouldn't have believed myself. He didn't call me from the car. He didn't say anything when he got back, didn't leave the wallet on the counter or ask me who it belonged to, but I knew he'd found it because it had been wedged between the seat and the console, partly hidden, but not enough to be missed. Not for a man like James, who notices everything, even the way the light changes in a room when something's been moved. It wasn't his wallet, and it sure as hell wasn't mine. It was worn at the corners and soft at the edges and had a cracked sticker on the back that read, "Truth is when your body stops lying before your mouth does." And that line, it felt less like a message and more like a punch. He didn't confront me. He didn't ask. He just pressed the button on the dash that activated the recording system, the same one he installed years ago and hadn't used since. And when I got in the car later that evening, I saw the small red light blinking quietly beneath the glove compartment, steady and unforgiving, like an eye that had just opened. You know that moment when someone doesn't accuse you of anything, doesn't even raise their voice, and it's somehow worse than screaming? That was this. Because silence, real, intentional, waiting silence, means they already know, and they're just watching what you'll do next. He didn't say anything about it, and he never gave me any kind of reason to believe he would. Yet from the very next morning, James began moving through the house with a new kind of calmness, one that felt nothing like peace and everything like quiet resolve. And although he continued to cook breakfast just like before, placing the mug of coffee beside my plate without needing to ask how I took it, something in the way he smiled while doing it made me feel like I was watching a man who had already made up his mind about something irreversible. It wasn't that he was acting cold or distant or passive-aggressive, because James had never been any of those things. And in fact, he was now somehow more attentive, more present, more helpful than he'd been in months. As if he had suddenly remembered all the small rituals that once made our home feel safe and was now determined to perform them with a precision that bordered on tenderness, only without the physical closeness that used to accompany them. He no longer kissed my forehead, no longer placed his hand on the small of my back when passing behind me in the kitchen. And though he still asked about my sleep and filled the car with gas before I noticed it was low, I felt the absence of touch more than the presence of any gesture. I moved through the day in a strange kind of limbo, caught between the memory of how things used to feel and the dread of what I had already done. And no matter how much I tried to return to routine, the rhythm of normal life now rang hollow, like an old melody I couldn't hum anymore without choking on the notes. There was a tension growing inside me, not the kind that leads to decisions or actions, but the kind that holds your ribs in a quiet vice and reminds you, with every breath, that the life you are living has already shifted into something you no longer fully recognize. So when Andrew messaged me late that afternoon asking if I needed a lift again today, I didn't think about the consequences, and I didn't weigh the morality of my response, because I already knew what I would do even before I began typing. I told him yes. I didn't try to justify the choice, not to myself and certainly not to him. And instead, I just grabbed my keys and walked to the car as if nothing about this moment was extraordinary, even though my heartbeat told me otherwise. The hotel was just outside the edge of town, nestled behind a strip mall and half hidden by a row of bent trees, and the hallway leading to the room smelled like disinfectant mixed with dust, the way places do when too much has happened between their walls and not enough has been spoken about it. We didn't say anything when the door closed behind us, didn't touch right away, didn't laugh or flirt or do any of the things people do when they're still pretending this might be innocent, because both of us knew exactly why we were there, and neither of us was naive enough to pretend otherwise. The physical part happened quickly, not in the sense of being rushed, but in the sense of being inevitable, because even though our hands still moved with a certain urgency, it wasn't driven by passion anymore. It was driven by repetition. Like an old performance, neither of us had the energy to rewrite. And while our bodies fit the same way, something in the room had changed. I didn't feel desire this time. Not really. What I felt instead was fear. Fear that the line between wanting and needing had long since disappeared, and all that remained was this compulsive escape, which no longer tasted like freedom but more like punishment. Afterward, we lay together on the bed for longer than usual, both of us quiet, both of us staring at the ceiling like there might be something up there worth holding on to. And then we moved to the window, him lighting a cigarette and me accepting it without protest. Even though I don't smoke, even though I knew it would burn my throat, I took the cigarette because it gave my hands something to do, because it filled my mouth with something other than excuses. And while we passed it back and forth in silence, he finally said, still without looking at me, "You don't seem like someone who loves. You seem like someone who hasn't been loved right in a long, long time." His words didn't cut through me sharply or make me angry or defensive, because there was something so disarmingly true about them that I didn't even try to resist. And instead, I just nodded slightly, my eyes still focused on the window where the streetlights flickered like dying stars. And in that moment, I didn't feel shame. I felt recognition. I felt like someone who had been diagnosed by a stranger holding the exact file I had been trying to lose for years. Later that evening, when I stepped back into our house and set my bag down quietly by the door, I immediately noticed the glow coming from James's office. A low, consistent light that reflected off the hallway wall in soft pulses, and even before I walked toward it, I already knew what I would find. He had his headphones on, and his posture was perfectly still. His body slightly leaned toward the monitor with that familiar intensity he used whenever he was focusing on something important, like editing videos from our vacations or researching new camera gear. But this time, the screen wasn't showing a beach or a backyard barbecue. It was playing footage from inside the car, muted, shadowed, clear enough. Two blurred silhouettes caught in the rhythm of emotion that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than what it was. There was no sound. Just the flicker of breath against glass, the fog on the windows, the slow, unmistakable pattern of movement that told the entire story without needing to spell a single word. James didn't turn around when I stepped closer, and he didn't pause the video, didn't shift in his chair, didn't ask where I had been or why I looked like I hadn't slept in days. He just pressed play again with deliberate calm, as if trying to memorize the shape of what was lost. Not out of cruelty, but out of something deeper, something colder, something final. And I just stood there, coat still on, skin clammy, throat dry, realizing that I hadn't just betrayed a person, I had betrayed someone who knew exactly what I was doing, and chose not to stop me. The plan was never to repeat anything, and yet there I was again, sitting behind the wheel, pretending the silence inside the car was still a coincidence, telling myself this was just another errand, another short ride, another ordinary excuse, even though the air between us had grown heavier, and even though my own reflection in the window no longer looked like someone who believed in control. When Andrew got into the car without hesitation, tossing his bag at his feet and buckling his seatbelt like it meant anything anymore, I didn't greet him. And he didn't ask if I was sure, because we had already passed the point where questions served a purpose, and now it was just repetition, one we both accepted without speaking it aloud. We drove in silence, the same route, the same turns, and when we finally pulled over near that forgotten side road where no one ever passed, I turned off the engine like I was switching off the part of me that still cared about logic, and we moved to the back seat without a word, without urgency, without the illusion of spontaneity. Because what we were doing no longer felt reckless or exciting or new. It just felt inevitable. And inevitability has a way of numbing the details. What I didn't realize, what I never even thought to check, was that the dashcam had been turned back on, that it had been quietly recording everything. The shape of our silhouettes, the pattern of the fog on the windows, the way the car swayed almost imperceptibly under the weight of our movements, capturing not just what we did, but what it meant. James had turned it on days ago, maybe weeks, not because he wanted to catch me, not because he was waiting to confront me, but because he already knew and needed proof to match the silence that had been building inside him like a wall too solid to ignore. Later, when I imagine him sitting at his desk watching that footage, I don't see him angry or heartbroken or violent. I see him still, completely still, his hands resting on the keyboard without movement, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on the screen while the woman he married disappeared frame by frame into someone he couldn't recognize. He didn't call me, didn't send a message, didn't ask questions or leave vague hints. He simply did what he always did when something broke. He solved it with precision. He saved the recording onto a flash drive, labeled it with my name, and placed it in a white envelope, folding the flap down as neatly as if he were closing a letter he never intended to mail. Then he took the divorce papers he had already filled out, signed, stamped, copied, and added them to the same envelope. No explanation, no margin for negotiation, just the clarity of a decision made by someone who refuses to shout. The wedding ring, the one he had worn through vacations and flu seasons and every quiet night of routine, he removed it carefully and placed it on the living room windowsill, not as a gesture but as closure. Unspoken, final, clean. Next to it, on a small piece of torn notebook paper, written in his perfectly measured print, he left a sentence that did not ask for attention, did not beg to be read twice, and did not carry any hatred in its weight. "You're not the enemy," it said. "You're just not the woman I want to protect anymore." And with those 14 words, he left behind not an accusation, but an ending I couldn't revise. When I came home that evening, the house felt too organized, like someone had straightened every detail for the last time. And as soon as I stepped into the kitchen and saw the envelope waiting for me on the table, stacked beside the paperwork and the ring, I understood that I wouldn't find him in the next room. Wouldn't hear the shower running or the TV murmuring in the background. I didn't open the papers first, didn't touch the ring, didn't even sit down. I went straight to the flash drive, plugged it in, clicked play, and watched as my body on screen confirmed every truth I had tried to keep quiet. The footage didn't lie, didn't stutter, didn't blur what mattered. It captured it all with brutal honesty, the windows fogging up in rhythm with our breath, the shape of my shoulder moving in ways that couldn't be explained as friendship or comfort, the tremble in the glass as the car gently rocked under our weight, the unmistakable fact that I had given something to someone who wasn't my husband, and that no amount of silence could ever make it undone. I watched the entire thing, not because I wanted to, not because I thought I could handle it, but because I knew I had to see what he saw, to understand how it looked when the person you trust becomes the one who erases trust completely. And when the screen went dark at the end and my own face flickered for the final time in the reflection, I didn't cry or scream or fall to the floor, because this wasn't grief, and it wasn't shock. This was recognition. I had become a file, a motion, a timestamp. And the version of me that existed in that recording would never be someone I could defend, because she had already told the truth in a way no apology ever could. A week had passed since everything ended in silence, and although his key was still on my ring, and although I reached for it every morning before leaving the apartment, and although my thumb still found the familiar edge worn smooth from habit, it no longer fit the door, because James had changed the lock quietly without announcement and without explanation, not out of cruelty or anger, but with the same calm finality he applied to every decision that truly mattered to him. And in that moment, I realized he hadn't disappeared out of spite or heartbreak, but simply because he no longer saw a reason to stay in a space where something irreversible had already been done, and no apology could return him to the man he was before the footage. The apartment felt like an empty shell, not because it had been stripped of furniture or light or routine, but because all the invisible signs of his presence had vanished without a trace, as if someone had walked through the rooms collecting every small fragment of who he used to be and taken them without slamming the door or leaving a note. And now the air no longer smelled like morning coffee or aftershave, and there were no half-read books folded open on the couch arm, no humming in the bathroom, no quiet question drifting from the hallway asking if I had any plans in the morning. And as I sat by the window surrounded by stillness that used to feel peaceful, I understood for the first time that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a verdict already delivered. I stepped into the elevator with slow, uncertain feet. Not because I didn't know where I was going, but because the hallway felt longer than it ever had before. And as the doors opened on the first floor, I saw the neighbor from below, the one with the gentle voice and the tired eyes who always carried too many bags and wore her sweater sleeves rolled to the elbows, and just before I passed her, she looked at me with a kind of knowing I hadn't earned, and said softly, as if remembering something from her own past, "James is one of those men who doesn't raise his voice. They just leave and never return. And that's the kind of silence that hurts more than anger." And I nodded. Not because I agreed or disagreed, but because I recognized the truth of her words like a bruise I had only just discovered. Andrew disappeared too, and this time there were no rehearsals, no drawn out exits, no half hearted messages filled with half meant apologies. Just a blank space where his music used to seep through the wall at night, and his footsteps echoed in the stairwell. And at first I noticed his absence like a skipped heartbeat, like a call that never comes when you expect it most. But soon even that passed. And I realized I didn't feel longing or regret or the ache of abandonment. I felt nothing, and not because it had never mattered, but because its cost had finally revealed itself, and it was too steep to mourn again. I returned to the car one afternoon out of habit, or maybe curiosity, or maybe because I wasn't sure what else to do with my hands. And when I opened the door, I was startled by the strange sense of order inside, because everything was clean and untouched and neutral as if the vehicle had been reset or blessed or erased, and the seat was back in its normal position. The mirrors aligned, and on the dashboard there were two rings placed beside each other, not tossed, not hidden, not symbolic. Just sitting there with a flash drive between them and a note in that same careful hand I knew by heart, which read, "You chose the feeling, I chose the truth. And now here we are." And I stared at those words until they stopped being words and became a mirror I couldn't turn away from. My hands looked strange to me in that moment as I reached out to take the flash drive, not because they had changed in any physical way, but because I no longer recognized what they had done or who they had touched. And as I turned them over slowly in the pale afternoon light, I saw fingers that once shook when held in affection, and knuckles that had clenched in anger, and palms that had opened in wanting. And I thought these were never the hands of a mistress or a liar or even a coward. They were the hands of someone who once wanted to be loved so badly that she confused heat with presence and desire, with proof and glances with promises, and then called it enough. I left the elevator behind and climbed the stairs instead, not out of symbolism or guilt, but because I needed to feel every step underfoot, needed to carry the weight of my own story up through the layers of a building that had witnessed all of it. And on the landing between the second and third floor, I paused as if summoned by something older than memory, and stood in that familiar stretch of hallway where once I had stood too long looking into the eyes of someone I should never have invited closer, and I leaned against the wall. Not because I was tired, but because I needed to remember that a single look can become a doorway, and every doorway leads somewhere even if you pretend it doesn't. I don't miss him. Not the way people miss people when they're gone. Not in the way that makes you reach for a photo or a sweater or a smell. I don't regret the kisses. Not the first. Not the last. Not the ones that made me forget the shape of my own shame. What I mourn is what I lost without even realizing I was losing it. The quiet safety of a man who never asked me for anything but the truth, and whom I traded for a momentary flame without even blinking. Now I stand here on this landing between floors, between versions of myself, between what I chose and what I destroyed, knowing one thing with more certainty than I have ever known anything before. Trust once broken cannot be rewoven if the thread was me all along.